Don't be shy to sit at the front. You can sit at the front. That is okay. I'm just going to pop my head in Dickens. Were you the last people out of the room? Right, thanks everyone. I think we ought to get going. Is that okay? Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming along. For those of you who are regular Digital Conversations attendees, obviously normally we have these in the main part of the building, but I'm sorry, because there's building works going on, we've had to move into conference centre tonight, but I hope that's okay. Yeah, if you could shut the library. So tonight's talk is part of a kind of regular programme of events. So normally 3 or 4 times a year we pick a theme and invite a panel of speakers and we talk about something, a digital conversation on a topic of interest. I'm absolutely delighted that tonight is on the topic of PhD theses and multimedia, transmedia, non-text, which covers all sorts of PhD theses which are not digital but are not standard PhD theses. And I want to welcome, so this is Coral. Coral's going to be chairing tonight. I'm just doing the introduction to explain why it's a digital conversation. Coral's been doing an amazing 3-month PhD placement here in the library for our EThOS service. So we've got our EThOS manager, Sarah Gould, in the audience. So EThOS in the library is a service providing electronic PhD theses. So Coral's project, which I'll let her talk about in a little bit detail, has been basically trying to scope out this landscape of how do we think about collecting and preserving, and what should we do with all of these innovative people who are doing a non-standard PhD. Is that a good explanation? I'm going to sit down and eat my cheese straws. So anyway, thank you. And we've got a schedule, so there will be a half time so we can top up our glasses, but I will let Coral run the show.
Oh dear. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Yes, and we're going to be, so this is kind of the end really of the 3-month project, looking at multimedia PhDs and possibilities for making these successful in the future, possibly using EThOS web service. And I think I'm part of a cohort of people who do research placements at the library, and interestingly enough, everyone else is very much involved in collections, but I decided to approach mine by going out and having conversations with current academics, people who have finished their PhDs relatively recently, and to talk about what innovative multimedia kind of stuff is going on out there. I've just realised I'm just talking to someone else's
And the hashtag is BL Digital, so
yeah.
put that on there. So.
This is me. Yeah, and please follow EthosBL on Twitter. So I've been going out and having these conversations, and today we've all been in a workshop, so we're all quite tired, and we've been lots of academics and PhD students kind of really just talking about these issues, talking about digital preservation with library staff, and it's been a really great day and a really great workshop. And tonight is kind of a celebration of just everything interesting that we've kind of uncovered. So I've picked 3 people who have provided case studies, just because I think that their work's really innovative and interesting, and multimedia is very important to what they do, and they've had some interesting experiences while submitting theses. So I just really want to sort of sum up some of the themes, I guess, that I've come across through doing these case studies. By the way, you can find these case studies on the British Library website. They're kind of going up as we speak. So the first thing is just there's been a really cross-disciplinary theme going through the research. So a lot of people doing some really innovative stuff, but having to go, because especially being in a digital realm, having to go outside of what their normal PhD is. So this is Jo Hale. We can see her from the back a bit. So she's with UCL, and she's trained in psychology, but she actually had to spend the first year of her PhD learning to program virtual reality avatars for the study of mimicry. So you can see that, and then that's taken her research into a completely new realm. And that's something, again, interesting in multimedia, because we think of researchers as researching somebody else or something else. But when we're working in multimedia, these researchers are becoming producers. And I met a researcher from Warwick, Sam Martin, and she's produced this app called Spoony Living App. And it's for studying people with celiac disease, with a gluten intolerance, and how they sort of self-manage their own sort of eating. And so it's a way of getting people communicating within that community, but then also she takes the data from that to make discovery for her thesis about helping people to self-manage their autoimmune deficiencies. Other things that have been really interesting is people's creative responses to the thesis. So this is Katharina, and she is an illustrator, and she illustrates picture books. So what's really interesting about what she's done is she's approached the thesis in the same way she approaches a picture book. So she's got one text volume of a thesis and one image volume of a thesis, and you read them together. Unfortunately, when her thesis was due to go online, a lot of copyright restrictions came in, and her image part of it, even though a lot of the images are her own, she's an illustrator, most of that was redacted and had to be embargoed, which is a real shame. So often, the most interesting things that we produce are multimedia. And our multimedia work actually speaks to a much wider audience. It is more engaging to people outside of academia. A thesis is something that is quite scary. It's a big volume of text. It's got a very specific language. So when we can use our multimedia work, we can actually widen the audience that our work is appealing to. But there's issues preserving this work. So we're asking, is it possible to rethink our thesis? Is it possible to rethink them, including multimedia, to sit in this digital world? And we also had Mark Harnell from Figshare talking today about his work, and he provided a case study too, because he's within the realm of science, so he's actually set up his own online repository to share multimedia work, to share scientific data. And it's so important within his field, because if you can't share scientific data, we wind up repeating experiments, we wind up doing things over again, we waste a lot of time, and we waste a lot of resources. And within some of these subjects, those time and resources can cost people their health. So it's quite a serious subject, and also really great that he's done what he's done. And I think one of the real key things that we've noticed is, while making a multimedia PhD might seem, very in vogue, it might seem like, it's something that people would be interested in, it's something that looks impressive, but it also is to do with efficiency. So if you have a video of two cells moving, and you need to describe that video to a future researcher, and you have to describe it in text, you're wasting your own time, and also it's very difficult to describe what is happening visually in that video. So why can't we just include the video? And that's when we're thinking about how we communicate our research, and we have the technology to do it. It's interesting that we can't kind of break through those barriers. So a lot of this is actually coming to be a necessity. It's a necessity to share this work, so we know what came before, so we can build on data, and we can better show people our research and share that to a wider audience. And multimedia can make our theses richer, can make the audience wider, and can really illustrate so well things that we're trying to express in text. And I think from everyone I've spoken to, no one's talking about replacing academic language. No one's talking about replacing the body of the thesis. What we're talking about is augmenting it, and augmenting it with this much richer set of research outputs, just to make our thesis easier to disseminate and more valuable, I guess, to the research community. So on that note, I think we're just going to kick off, and we're going to go for the first speaker, who is Imogen Lesser, who her work was actually recommended to me that I pursue for a case study. And she was the first case study I did, kicking off the whole project. And her work was, and her way of describing it was something that definitely inspired the rest of the project. And we can see, hopefully later, some of her drawings. So,
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's all very exciting, very impressive, and I feel very small in comparison to all of this. So my research, I'm at the University of Kent. I'm at the final stages of my PhD. Hopefully handing in December, but with these things, who can tell? So my work, so I'm with the architecture school. My thesis is an architecture thesis, but most of my research comes from Marvin Peake's Gormenghast trilogy and the associated short story Boy in Darkness. So this is Marvin Peake, and these are his books. So what I'm looking at is language, and it stems from my architectural education, which I discovered there is a strange conflict in architecture between architecture and language. Obviously, it's inherent in what we do. We stand up, we talk, we present. It's part of the whole education is that we talk about our work. We write about our work, we do the academic essays, all that sort of thing. But there's a strange kind of dichotomy which says that architects shouldn't talk. I don't know if anyone's come across the Petricuccia format. So it's 20 slides, you get 20 seconds for each slide, that's it. And this was invented by architects. Because, and I quote, architects talk too much. That's it. So there's an entire format based around the fact that we just can't shut up. And that seems a real shame because we, as a discipline, have to talk to so many different people about so many different things. It's not just theoretical architecture, it's also building, talking to builders, talking to clients, we have to sell ideas, we have to talk to the public, we have to write journal articles. There's all of this going on, and yet the students don't understand why they're writing essays. And there are formats coming out where architects talk too much. So, this is ridiculous. So what I've done, and a lot of this is digital, a lot of this is manual, so you'll have to sort of give the slight crossover. So Peake talks about his space, and he talks about them in a beautifully poetic way. But he also includes things like measurements, sensory qualities. He talks about how sound travels in a room or how air travels in a room, qualities of light, qualities of atmosphere. All of these things are architectural qualities. He was a writer, which is what he's now most famous for, but he was an artist and an illustrator. He thought of himself as an artist. And this comes across in his language. So the first thing I did was to compile a digital document of all of his spaces. There are 207 spaces in his book, not including things like corridors and transition spaces. They tend to be interlinked. And this slightly blurry image is an Excel document that I created. of every single space that has any data about it. Some of them, there are a few that are just a name, no information, just a name. But then these columns map out all the different qualities that he talks about in each space. So things like the light qualities, the textures, the acoustic qualities, what time of day spaces are at, what time of, what notable features there are, whether there are any known measurements, all of that sort of thing. Really kind of dry, let's take this text apart and really kind of ruin it for everyone, sort of thing. So, but that's not architecture. Yeah, you can take the qualities of this room and you can put them in this table, but it doesn't really tell you much about the space. You could list its dimensions, but without actually understanding what the space is, there's no point. So one of the things that I was very certain about when I started my thesis, when I went in with the proposal for my PhD, was that I needed to be able to draw, I needed to be able to create models of space. This is how I'm trained. I've got 2 degrees in architecture. I have been trained to think through drawing, through modelling, and yet when you come to a PhD, the first thing you say, right, is you're going to now write 80 to 100,000 words. And you think, where has this come from? I mean, yes, I've written essays, but we're talking 3,000 words. There's a bit of a discrepancy. So the first thing I did was map it. Firstly, in some really kind of simple, this is just in InDesign, how do spaces connect to other spaces? I've got a series of these. I'm not going to show you all of them, but this is the sort of the overview of. So there are 3 sort of categories. There's the ones in the castle, the ones near the castle that are visually connected, and the ones that are really far away. So you then end up with a series of connections between space. But once again, it's not really very architectural. It does tell you some more stuff, but it's so kind of dry, and you think, okay, so what is in the castle south wing? What is in the city forest? And the way we understand landscapes is through maps. So I mapped some things. Firstly, in the digital realm. So this is sort of data that you can just extract from his novels. So there are pathways, there are routes, there are distances. The beauty of digital mapping, of digital drawings, this is all done in AutoCAD, is that for a start it's iterative. You can copy and paste as many times as you want, you can shift things, you can move things, and you can end up with something that looks vaguely like this, which again doesn't really tell you very much. This is where the non-digital aspects come into it. And from this, which is in fact sort of the castle, the spaces within it, I then did this. So this is a printout, which I've then drawn over. So this is where I stopped being digital. Although actually with the maps, though, I then had to re-digitize them in order to put the text on. So for this series of maps, I then went on to a series of architectural drawings and a set of architectural models. So this is sort of a really quick sort of overview. But there's a significant portion of my research time has been put into drawing, which for me makes a lot of sense. This is architecture, this is what we do. Whether it's digital, whether it's by hand, architects express themselves visually. And yes, we stand up and talk, but we need the visual props to do that. If I was to talk about this without having done the drawings and models, you'd, for a start, be bored to tears, but also I wouldn't really have anything to talk about. So I did a series of long sectional drawings. Now I've got them over there. If you could not put any food or wine anywhere near them, that would be great, because they are the originals. But I will talk to you when we have time to stand up and talk. So I've done this series of drawings. So the originals are 2 meters by 750 millimeters tall. They're big. Again, time and sort of energy that goes into something that isn't traditionally PhD thesis. You can't just fold this up and stick it in a book. You can't. I mean, I could write about it. I could write exactly what I've done, but what would be the point when I've got the drawing? So the conversation that I'm having at the moment is, how do I submit this? Well, I've ended up with a traditional thesis as well as a lot of architectural drawings and architectural models. The problem for me lies in the fact that it's not design in the traditional sense, so it can't be classed as a PhD by design, which means I'm doing a PhD by thesis. Now, if you do a PhD by design, you get a reduced word count. If you don't, you've got the full thing to deal with, which In some ways, it's fine because actually I waffle on quite a lot, so which I'm struggling with at the moment, trying to reduce that down. But also means I'm basically doing 2 theses, one of which is by design, which is not quite design, and one of which is the written text. So I can show you some more pictures because, you know, why not? And also, I don't think many people are going to read my thesis. It's going to be somewhere between 80 and 100,000 words, and it's not really very accessible. You know, so far, there are 2 other people who've read it. I'm hoping to get at least 1 more to read it at some point, but if not 2. But there's, you know, it's quite daunting to say to someone, look, can you read this and tell me what you think of it? Particularly because most people's immediate reaction is, well, I'm not an architect, I won't know what we're talking about. And I think, well, actually, that's not why I'm asking you to read it necessarily. I need someone to tell me if actually it makes any sense. But then also, the point of what I'm doing is I want to talk to architects. I want to talk to the architectural community and say, look, here is a language that we can use that is accessible. All the words that Peake uses in his descriptive text are found in the dictionary. Some of them might be a bit archaic, but they're not coined words. They have a definition, they have a recognised understanding. His characters coin words, but his spatial descriptions never do. There are typing mistakes, but you can read the words. Whereas a lot of architectural discussion happens at the moment, and they're coining words out of the air. And you think, well, actually, I don't know what that means, and I've got architectural training, so if I don't know what that means, then the public doesn't know what that means. So why are we doing this? So I did an exhibition. Here's some models. Yeah. I didn't bring these with me, by the way. They're too heavy, and they're in Yorkshire. But, you know, did some models. So I did an exhibition of this on my work, which is so much more accessible to the public. I can put, I put my giant drawings on the wall, and people looked around, and people could ask me questions, and people could access this. I got different levels of questions from different people, whether or not they'd read the books. I put some of Peake's text next to it so that you could relate the two and read it if you wanted to. And it was fantastic because you can then see the scale of my table. This is the same table as was on the first slide, but printed out on A0 sheets. So that's fairly large. All at size 10 font, which is a bit small for things, but obviously you need to be able to read it when you're there, but it needs to be accessible. So, but this exhibition, again, time heavy, emotionally heavy, but actually it's quite light in the thesis. I sort of mention it, but it's not one of the most in-depth discussions because a lot of what people get out of the exhibition I can't analyse. I didn't ask people to fill out questionnaires, I didn't want people to have to then analyse their own thoughts whilst they were in there, and I just wanted to talk to people and see what they thought. So it's not really very defined, so it's not then a major part of the thesis. So I don't know how I'm doing for time. What does it
So I'm absolutely fascinated.
So there are some really interesting issues that come from this in terms of the architecture, but also in terms of what a thesis is. There's an expectation that that a doctoral thesis is a written document. I've read some really interesting papers on PhDs by design, not necessarily or PhDs by practice, sorry, not within architecture but within the art sort of community. And the conclusions that I've drawn is that people don't really know what they are. There's a need for them, there's an understanding, but there isn't the object kind of knowledge of what that is. So a doctoral thesis, there is an understanding that it is a book of a certain thickness, that it's a certain font size, you have certain margins, you have certain fonts that you can use, that you can give this to a library and it will sit there in all its glory collecting dust. But there isn't such a thing for PhD by design or PhD by practice. And then how do I put all of these things in? So I am stuck at the moment. So this is the drawings at the back. To zoom in to see the detail, I mean, it's hard on a PowerPoint slide. Things end up very blurry, but I have to hand in my file size for my thesis should be below 64 megabytes. And I have, as you can tell, a lot of visual stuff to deal with. So I don't know how I'm going to do that, but the quality of the images is going to be greatly reduced. I mean, when I submit to the examiners, I'm going to print off copies of all of these and send them in as an appendix. But for the library submission, I can't do that because the file is going to be too big. So I found today was really, really interesting because it's, for a start, it's not just me having these problems, but that actually the British Library is talking about this and it's important. We need to be able to store this, and this isn't the end of the world. You know, this is just some pictures and some models. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd end up with a 3D scan of the models that I could, you know, as a reader, you could go in and explore. But I can take photographs. There are so many other people there today that you think, I have no idea how you would put that into a file. You know, how do you collect this information and store it in a way that means that it's accessible and that it makes sense? So I think I'm going to stop there and pass the conversation on to someone else. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Mindy. That was really interesting, and I think it's kind of, you know, when you think about the value in what's been produced and the beauty of the drawings and the fact that this isn't going to be accessible in the way she would choose because it's something like 64 megabytes in this day and age, you know. So I'm going to pass on now, and I'm going to pass on to Craig Hamilton, who I actually saw speaking about his project at a conference, and I kind of seeked him out to do a case study for the digital for the projects I've been doing, and particularly because of kind of relationship with archiving.
Hello. Okay. Thanks to Coral for inviting me today. It has been a really, really interesting session all day, so I've been really pleased to be here. What I'd like to do with my 10 minutes is just give you a quick overview of my work with the Archive project, which relates to the experience of popular music listeners. I'd like to show you how working through some methodological challenges with my project has led me towards the creation of some multimedia and non-text outputs, which I'll then discuss in a bit more detail. And along the way, I'll try and explain why I think those are important in a wider sense. I think in terms of the wider PhD and also the outputs, it's important to explain how I got here. I spent a lot of time working in music and technology industries. I started working in second-hand record shops just up the road from here. I've lost my bearings, but I think that way, in Berwick Street in Soho and Camden. Am I right? Yes. Okay, it's that way.
Yeah.
And at that point, this is in the early 90s, vinyl records were completely unwanted, and the CD was king. Nowadays, of course, you can't give CDs away, and people will pay £30 for a vinyl record. So it's a funny old game. But what's happened in the interim has been the emergence of digital technologies, and they've now become the primary means by which recorded music is distributed and consumed. And so a lot has changed for people that love popular music, and it's our experience with those changes that I'm primarily interested in with my research. So in 2011, after a long time out of education, I went back to school and did my MA in Music Industries at BCU, and during that time I developed Archive, and that went quite well, which led the people at BCU to say, well, you should turn that into a PhD, and here I am. So what is Archive? Archive, it's two words put together, hark as in to listen, and archive. And what I do those of you that might be familiar with kind of mass observation projects, I collect stories from people about their experience on a single day each year. So stories are collected online through either social media channels, or longer form responses are collected through email or online forms. And since starting in 2013, so I've run 4 of these annual days so far. I've collected around 8,000 stories, and the project itself has kind of taken me by surprise in the sense that it's generated a hell of a lot of positive media coverage, including being on Radio 4 Today, which is, you know, was quite interesting. So my original hope of turning this archive thing, into an annual event seems to be going quite well. And the good news for my future research, from a selfish point of view, is that if I keep doing this every year, archive should continue to generate some useful data. But in terms of the immediate concern of the 3-year PhD, it revealed a methodological headache. Basically, I had 8,000 stories, and what am I going to do with these things? How am I going to make sense of them? Okay. So the solution I alighted upon, which I guess is what the whole PhD revolves around, is that in order to understand and critique the effects of digital technologies on the popular music experience, I wanted to subject the data I'd collected to many of the same techniques that increasingly are coming to bear on the popular music experience. So where listening creates data points that are analysed to inform interface design, which in turn impact upon listening. Okay, this kind of increasingly closing circle. So I want to critically engage with those processes and techniques. So in my head, that was a neat circle, but that neat circle, that idea of how I was going to kind of execute this PhD, revealed a problem, and the problem boiled down to this. As somebody who'd played guitar and worked in record shops and so on and so forth, I was reasonably tech savvy, but I wasn't a coder, I wasn't a data scientist, but I'd kind of gone down this route of, well, I'm gonna analyse this data, you know, but I didn't know how to do it. So it's the process of finding out how I would do that is pretty much precisely what's led to the creation of these kind of non-text and multimedia outputs of my research, and that's what brings me here today. Okay. So the process started by me realising around about 9 months into my PhD that I needed to rapidly skill up. Okay. Both conceptually in terms of how data is understood, but also practically in terms of how it's used industrially and in academic research. So I immersed myself in the data world. Okay, I attended conferences like London Big Data Week. I started going to pubs and meeting, you know, tech guys in pubs. It's a bit like being single, I guess. I haven't been single for many years, but I imagine it's a bit like that. Except you're meeting tech guys rather than girls. I started listening to data podcasts, and eventually I through this kind of research, I alighted on this big circle here, R. And R is what I kind of went, right, yeah, that's my thing. That's what I'm going to use to critically engage with these processes. So I'm not sure how many of you know about R. Just a quick show of hands, who does know what R is? 1, 2, 3, okay. I apologise in advance if I make this a really, really stupid explanation of R, but basically it's an open source piece of software that's very, very powerful in terms of organising, analysing, visualising data. So it was initially developed as a piece of statistical software, but through the efforts of a community of developers that have coalesced around it, R can now be used for textual analysis, interactive online visualisation, and a host of other things. But I think the really important thing about R for our purposes today is that there's this culture around it of collaboration and sharing. And it's this culture that's basically helped me learn it from scratch in 9 months. Okay, I'm not by no means an expert, but from not being able to use R to being able to analyse my data using R in 9 months, that wouldn't have happened with me hitting the books, that's happened because I've been able to look at what other people have posted online. Okay. So what's interesting about that culture of sharing and collaboration is that if you look at kind of scholars in the humanities and the social sciences, particularly those that are interested in data, that's something that people are, there's a move towards. There's definitely a movement towards this kind of collaborative working with data. So this approach then not only produces a warm fuzzy feeling because we're human beings and we like to share, and that's good, but it also seems to be part of a wider shift in how academics are working, and I think that's what this event today has been about as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to kind of briefly describe some of the non-text and multimedia outputs that are coming out of my research, coming out of my own learning. So some of these directly relate to ideas around collaboration and sharing in terms of data and coding, but others are more sort of non-general, non-text methods of dissemination. But I kind of see all of them as part of the work that I've been doing. And I think the really important thing is that they assist me in talking to different audiences about the work that I do. So in other words, they help me generate interest in my project, archive, but they also help me attract people that might be interested in collaborating with me. And they also help me think about my work in different ways. They help me. It helps me break down my work into a process. So these are some of them. So I'll quickly rattle through these. The first one is the archive Data Explorer. So this is an online interface that enables people to search through the data I've collected based on sort of some basic search parameters. And this is toward the kind of eventual aim that archive would be a useful resource not only for academic researchers but also for anybody that's just interested in pop music in the way that I am. So because I'm going to continue with these annual archive days every year, this repository I suppose is going to grow, and one of my kind of aims of my postdoctoral phase, if I get there, when I hand in my thesis, whatever shape that might take, is to begin augmenting this data with supplementary data that relates to it so that it becomes richer. So my hope is that this will continue to grow into a kind of a longitudinal historical resource that people who might be interested in pop music in 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 could kind of use. Okay, so that's one thing. A more developer kind of tech focused version of the same thing is the archive API, which I developed this year. So this came out of my work with R, and in particular the need for developing a robust rationale around data collection and organisation. So again, I don't want to go into too much boring detail about what APIs are, but in really simple terms, they allow access to data in structured ways so that applications and other tools can be built upon them. The crucial thing about an API is that although the data may change over time, the structure remains constant. So these visualisations here were built for the archive day in 2016, and they changed dynamically throughout the day as the data changed, but the structural dynamics of the code that builds these visualisations didn't change. Okay, so I think that's a really kind of crucial point. So what it means for the data that I collect in terms of kind of open access to data, which is increasingly becoming an important thing in academia, is that I can provide kind of open access to my data, but I can control it in terms of my privacy and kind of ethical obligations. But it also means that the integrity of the data is protected in that I'm not handing over a spreadsheet of raw data to you, which you can then change. I've got the data, I'm just giving you access to it. You can do with it what you will, but the data is protected, okay, to an extent. The next thing is the code repository, which again comes out of my work with R, and it's early stages. There's a few things up there. but again, GitHub is where you can kind of share code and data with people. And kind of what it means is I'm a novice R coder, so I put my R code up there. It opens this up to the possibility that more experienced R coders can kind of go, well, actually, you're doing that in a very inefficient way, or this data that you put up could be analysed in a different way. Okay, so it kind of separates the code from the data. So the first thing I've put up there is some survey analysis, some very sort of simple survey analysis. You could take that code and apply it to your own survey, or you could take the the data from the survey and go and do a completely different analysis. Okay, that's great. That's great from my point of view because you're using my data and my code, and I can see it, and it gets both of which get improved upon. Okay. The kind of cool thing, the techie cool thing from a GitHub point of view is that there's change management built into it. So that original version that I put up there, if this gentleman here in the shirt decides to improve upon it, he can go and improve upon it, but my original version's still there, and then his version, and so on and so forth. So there's kind of like a tree. So at some point in that code, there might be something that's useful to you. You can take that and it exists. It doesn't disappear. The next thing is my horrible mugshot from BCU, which I hate. But every time I post on the BCU website, this automatically comes up. I look far too pleased with myself in that picture. I hate it, but they won't let me change it. What I do with this process is I've started creating some sort of some how-to videos and some blog posts where I kind of go, well, this particular very small aspect of what I do, here's how you do it. So this one here, which you can find on archive.org, I tell you how to scrape data off social media. Okay, so you might not be interested in popular music, you might not be interested in analysing data, but you might be interested in pulling data off social media. So I've kind of tried to make it accessible and general enough so that anybody that wants to pull data off social media can look at this and use it. And the final thing, which doesn't relate to data, and this is just something I've enjoyed doing, is I've started making the Archive podcast. And in that I interview people who do interesting things with their popular music listening. The latest one, I've only done 2 so far, there's a couple in development. The latest one was with a lady called Kathy, who runs an online second-hand 8-track business in Texas, in the United States. So she sells 8-tracks. And it's something that I was thinking about today because it came up about formats and about technologies. A big part of Kathy's business is people used to use 8-tracks to record their family gatherings and people talking. And so you've got grandma and granddad who died many years ago, and these recordings are locked up in these obsolete formats, and it's Kathy's job to kind of digitise them, and so we talk about that in the podcast. So there's that, which is kind of not data focused. That's just a bit me kind of like, I wish I was a radio star. We've got about 20 listeners so far, but maybe that'll grow. So that's me. That's me on Twitter, that's Archive on Twitter. If you've got any questions, then please email me. And if you'd like to look at the Archive project in a bit more detail, then everything that I've talked about is on the website. Okay? Thank
you. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, that was really inspiring, and I think the kind of the ethos of open access and of sharing beyond the academic realm there is really exciting. So we're going to keep rocking on, and we're going to introduce Tara Hopperstone, who's kind of been in the project from the start. Like on my first day, I met her through Skype, but I've met her physically now towards the end, and her work in archaeology and gaming is just super exciting. But I think we'll have Tara, and then we'll break for wine and food, and then maybe do questions.
So you can have some wine and think about the questions.
All right. As Coral
Coral introduced, my name's Tara Copplestone and I'm an archaeo gamer. Now I sort of get two responses to this. It's the combination of archaeology and gaming. And I quite naively rocked up to university thinking that people would take this quite seriously as an academic subject. And I got two responses. One was from the students who were like, wow, that's insane, like that's so cool, we get to play games and do archaeology. And the other side is, don't be ridiculous, that's not an academic subject. So I'm going to sort of talk you through today a little bit about what it is that I do with archaeology and games, what the kind of discipline entails as a whole, and how this has impacted on my ability to actually do a PhD. So a lot of people kind of get this impression that archaeogaming as a subject must be Lara Croft or Indiana Jones, that we kind of just walk into games and study archaeologists. And this is certainly like a quite valid part of the discipline, studying representations, not only of the archaeology, but of the people as well who are doing it. Moving down the list, we can look at things like ethics, like actually excavating the code of games. Recently there was the Atari excavation where we're excavating physical game cartridges out of the archaeological record. And then all the way down here is what I do, which is I make games. And the reason why I make games is to try to think about how the media form of video games impacts how we can do it, how we can do and think about archaeology. So to kind of put this into context, I did the formative part of my archaeological training in a place called Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island. And we're walking around, and it's a really dynamic place. There's a lot of great sort of interactivity, a lot of sort of multi-layered stories, a lot of stories which don't just have one route through them. They have this sort of great multilinearity and reflexivity to them. Yet what we were doing was collecting points on a page, and we would then print those out to a map, and then we would interpret them later. So there was this kind of archaeological process which was embedded into the media forms that we were using, which wasn't actually how we were experiencing the record or how it appeared in the past. So there's this complete disjuncture between how we think of the past, how we do the past, and how we record and present it. And of course, I wrote an undergraduate dissertation about this project, and it was a 20,000 word thesis, which no one has ever read, which sits in the library, which talks about hierarchy, emergence, and interactivity, and it is a static, formal document. And at this point, I thought maybe there's something a bit wrong with this. I'm a pretty avid video gamer myself, and I thought, well, you know, you sit down and you write a text or you read it, you sit down and you watch a movie, and there's a very particular power dynamic or a very particular way that you give and receive information in these forms. In video games, or in certain video games definitely, you can almost invert this power structure. So your player becomes an active participant. They are what drives the story. And in certain instances, they actually become what creates the story. They become co-creators with you. So I kind of went to the university and said, could you please give me some funding to do a PhD so I could research what it means to make these video games, to go onto sites, and to sit with people, to sit with archaeologists, and to make these games. So luckily, I got the funding. That was great. Thanks, Digital Creativity Labs. And so now basically, the first part of my PhD is to go out into these archaeological excavations, to sit and do my archaeological practice, to dig. And whilst I'm doing that, to make games. The second part is to go and work with game developers who have made games about the past and think about, well, why have they represented the past in particular ways? What other ways could we be doing this in archaeology? A third strand is to go and work with other archaeologists and get them to design games and to record kind of what their creative practices, how the media form is shaping what they're doing. Turns out that it's a pretty big impact. We'll get into that in a bit as to why that might be the case. But this is actually really well documented in media theory, which is that me standing here and talking to you now has a very particular structure enforced upon it, based upon the fact that I'm actually speaking to you. If I was to present this as a Word document on the screen and you were to just read it, again, there's a very particular structure to that. It's something that a guy called McLuhan, it's a little outdated now, but he basically says that the medium is the message, that the thing which we presented on, whether that's a piece of paper or a slideshow or me standing here talking, controls how we can actually present information. So when we talk about this in terms of video games, they have very different narrative structures, very different things which are embedded into the forms, which allow us to think and talk and do differently. So in a sort of traditional Word document, you progress from like one sentence to the next, to the next, to the next. When you do it in video games, you can have these like ridiculous branching structures. You can be multilinear, you can be procedural, you can be computational. You can have things which your user has to put back into or which generates variables out of it. So when you create narrative structures for a video game, you're not just creating one strand which is received in one way. You can do that. It's not a very effective use of the media form. But you can also create these great branching narratives. Obviously, this comes to a bit of a head when you're then trying to take writing and creating in this way and putting it back into that Word document. So this sort of came to a fore when I was starting to talk about what I was going to actually produce as my thesis. Because I make games, I work with other people to make games, and I record the process of making games. And none of these find a particularly easy fit into a traditional linear document structure. So I went to the library and I said, well, could I actually make my thesis as a game? And they were like, yes, if it's a PDF. And I was like, I don't think we're really having the same conversation here. And we talked a little today that there was one archaeologist who has produced a non-text thesis, a guy called Cornelius Holtoff. And he did it through hypermedia or through hypertext. And that was a really brilliant example of, or a brilliant kind of forerunner to what we thought would happen with PhD theses in archaeology. We talk all the time about how different people can have different interpretations, how archaeological interpretations change over time, and yet we never put this back into how we write. Cornelius made an attempt to do this through the way he published his thesis, but we haven't really taken that anywhere. And same with mine at the moment. It's kind of at a difficult point that the library just doesn't know how to deal with, or the library at York doesn't really know how to deal with anything outside of the normative practice. But as we kind of move through, one of the key things about games is interactivity. So when you take the interactivity out of the game, it's just code that sits there, or just art that sits there, or just audio that sits there in a compiled structure which no one can really access. You need the player to play it, and you need the person to make it as well. And in line with that, there's kind of, to move back to this idea that the media forms kind of construct and constrain how we can think and do things. There was a scholar called Ian Burgos who decided that there was something called procedural rhetoric, that basically the way which we craft arguments on paper is very different to how we can craft them in games. And this idea is that in games we craft them through the procedures or through the actual actioning of code. So the game itself is the argument. The act of playing it is the argument. It's not the art or the code itself, it's embedded within that relationship of the process, the playing, and the physical. So what does this mean for me? Well, I've made 8 case studies, and they're kind of all interesting in their own right, but the outcomes are not what is the point of my thesis, or what is the point of my practice. The point of my practice is the process of making these things, and it's about what that tells us about how we think about archaeology and what we're doing. Because there is a huge divide between how you would write, for example, a Word document about 1920s excavations, and how you can use the constraints or the affordances of the game medium to pull these apart. And it's very hard for me to stand here and tell you, in much the same way that it's very hard for me to then write this onto a piece of paper. So as I say, the thing which I'm really interested in trying to capture is the process, and I've had some difficulties with capturing this as well. So obviously, like, recording through pen and paper is one thing. This is part of my game design practice. But how do I record the moment of inspiration, or how do I record how we make games? Part of it obviously can be done through like screen capture software, but that only goes so far. That doesn't capture necessarily the conversations that we're having or the actions that are going on. So I ended up having to create my own application which sits on top of it, which basically records all the things that we're doing at one end. The outcome of this is that over 2 years of basically working full time on this every day, I have 32 terabytes of data. Which is quite a lot. And 32 terabytes when we're not even allowed 64 is just not going to fly. So how do I codify this? And the answer that I got given was transfer it into text, transcribe this into a text document. And I'm sure these people are very well-meaning, but it's when the point is to capture the process, when the point is to capture how procedural rhetoric, these different narrative structures are operating, and what the action of playing them is, to transfer that back to a plain text document is to kind of miss the point. And when I say process, I mean both the process of playing the games, of physically interacting with them, and also the process of making them. And another thing to note about my thesis as well is that a lot of the games are not just purely in the digital, they transcend into the physical as well. So we have a lot of like tangible controllers and a lot of like physical movement that you need to have as well. So, by far, the biggest comment that I get given in all the discussions that I've had is just to say, just put it in the appendix. And we get into this conversation which is about, well, I'm essentially then writing not only 2 PhDs, but potentially 3, because I'm producing the case studies, I'm recording the process of doing it, and then I'm having to write a 100,000 word thesis with all this stuff in the appendix, which I can't submit anyway, because it's above the tenure threshold. So there are some sort of clear issues with how we conceptualize and privilege the written word and the confines of the written word in our academic practices versus what we are actually capable of producing and what that might mean for archaeology. So in a way, this is kind of a 3-way problem in my very personal opinion. Firstly, firstly, the problem is that we're very used to privileging the written word and what it means to produce a thesis, like a physical book-based media form. And in line with that, it kind of comes into the problem of we have a very traditional mode of transition or transmission of knowledge, that we have the person who writes the thesis who's the like bringer of knowledge, and the recipient who is the passive receiver. When you want to step outside the bounds of that, when you want to co-create, when you want to have the reader as someone who actively puts back into your thesis, or this goes beyond the bounds of what you're writing in this one piece of written work, there are problems. For example, one of my games includes user feedback, which is ongoing, but when I hand my thesis in, the regulations state that it has to be like done and dusted. There can't be user feedback anymore. So it shuts down at that point. But the point was the process of making it, and it was the process of engaging with it. So to shut it down and stop it there seems again to kind of omit the point of the thesis. So I've had to come up with some quite sort of innovative ways to get around this. The first one is that if I can't hand in the games, if I can't hand in the process, I have to hand in words, well then play them at their own game. So I've created this thing called the Archaeo Gaming Idea Generator, which basically takes all the moments of inspiration that we record throughout the process, all the things that we create in these games, and crowdsources them and turns them into these generated ideas for games. And the idea is not that these are serious. The idea is that these then become a mechanism for thinking about the mechanics and the confines of the text-based medium into the game-based medium as well. And on the other side of this, also writing a lot of these, if anyone was around in like 90s, 2000s, these like how-to for dummies books. I've ended up writing a lot of these as well to go in with the thesis as a way to try to capture the process in line with it. But yes, that's me. If anyone has questions about gaming, archaeology, the overlap of these things, narrative structures, anything in general, can bring it up later. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, and what a great, I think, yeah, I don't think there's much else to add to that, except, you know, I'm really excited to see sort of what you wind up handing in and then when it goes from there. So there's more refreshments.
Yeah, should we take a 5-minute break? I know we've over a bit, but if we take 5 minutes, obviously if we go a little bit longer, if everyone fills their glass up or goes to the loo, whatever, quick comfort break, we'll come back in and then we'll think up your exciting questions and we'll do the Q&A. Don't go away.